Hello and welcome to our short session on COVID-19 and its impact on the student accommodation sector in particular. My name is Richard Smith. I'm a partner heading up the alternative investment side of the real estate team of Brodie's, and that obviously includes student accommodation. Joined today by my colleague Chris McDade, who's also here. Colleague is a partner in a real estate team specialising in investment and also in student accommodation. Morning to you, Chris.
Hello everyone.
I'm also joined today by Stewart Moore. Stewart is the CEO of CRM, which is one of the largest student accommodation providers in the UK. We're going to hear from Stewart on how COVID-19 has impacted on the student accommodation sector so far, what interim measures are ongoing, and what the future looks like for the sector. So, Stewart, good morning.
Good morning, Richard. Good morning, Chris.
So it's nearly 2 months now since the official lockdown occurred, and obviously at present a lot of students are either stuck in accommodation or have vacated altogether. The Scottish Government are also in the process of trying to issue some new legislation which will allow students to terminate their present tenancies on what will be 7 days notice for existing tenancies, and going forward on 28 days notices for future tenancies. Now that is not law now and is going through Holyrood at present. And we can obviously touch on the business plans that CRM and indeed others are going to be considering for the future and its implications. But what we thought we might focus on were the operational, legal and in fact strategic perspectives, which perhaps Stewart in his capacity at CRM can help us on. So Stewart, in the last couple of months, it must have been a very, very busy and hectic couple of months of unprecedented nature. What's the position regarding students requesting rental holidays, reductions in the current academic year, which obviously has got another 6 to 8 weeks still to go? Are they being asked for, and are they being granted?
Well, thanks, Richard. It has been a crazy time. It's something that we would never have planned for unless we had to before. And it has just been absolutely unprecedented. We hear that quite often in the news, but it's certainly the case. When we saw other countries across Europe becoming locked down, my senior management team and myself spent pretty much 2 weeks non-stop, including weekends and some very, very late nights, planning every course of action that we could take. CRM are in a peculiar position in that we only manage on behalf of clients. So we don't have any stock of our own in the UK. So we had to communicate all of these possibilities to our clients and then get their approval to carry out acts on their behalf. And as you can imagine, talking to over 65 different clients, from single family owners of buildings to large institutional investors, large PE firms, pension funds and the like, was really challenging. So what we actually ended up doing is looking at a number of different scenarios, one of which was universities effectively closing, which they have done, and then giving our clients an idea of their cash flow for the remainder of the year. And that cash flow was predicated upon a reduction, a discount, if you will, on the student's rent, or in fact not even waiving the last number of payments. In the end, we ended up with a very interesting position in that out of about 65 different owners, we ended up with 8 buildings that didn't waive the final rent call, which included one in Scotland, but all others did. Where that's ended up is those 8 buildings have caused problems in the market, and our competitors that haven't waived have had massive issues with petitions. I probably get an MP writing to me a day about some of their constituents. So CRM are in a very funny position. One is our tenants are legally obliged to pay, which is obviously of interest to you guys, but morally where do we stand? There's obviously the idea of frustration, and that's obviously true to some extent, but our clients may have other aspects. The government has given mortgage holidays to HMO, the typical HMO landlords. Purpose-built student accommodation is on finance. It's not on a mortgage, so there's no holidays there. So there's no real advantage of clients taking that. So it's been a real challenging time, and one which I don't think is going to go away in the short term. And I think, and we'll go on and talk about what the future and what the summer looks like for us, for the market, for investment, I'm sure. But really going forward, it's still such a moving playing field, if you will.
And do you have students who essentially are trapped in accommodation because they are from overseas and cannot get suitable travel arrangements to take them back home at the moment, and therefore still in occupation without any choice?
We've got it across our portfolio. On average, we're about 30 to 35% occupied at the moment, which is a number of students which can't return home because there are no flights and what have you. But some are staying because they want to. Some don't necessarily want to go home to their parents' house or what have you, and they enjoy their social aspect. We're still very much engaged with our students through virtual means, as you can imagine, given social distancing. But that, at the moment, 35% is about right. We'll see more as the country opens up over the next few months and flights open up. But at the moment, we're still seeing a lot of engagement by our students that are living with us.
And for those units that are void, ideally, as you've just said there, it's all built on finance. Everybody looks for other options that are available. What about alternative uses of accommodation? NHS key workers, albeit they perhaps are not permitted in terms of the legal documentation for that. Is that being explored? Would you like to see a more flexible approach for that?
I'd love to see something more that we can do with our buildings. We've been very much engaged with the procurement and the real estate team at NHS at the moment to see if we can get NHS key workers into our buildings. Also homeless people. Homeless people are being placed into Travelodge, and again, we'd love to do that. But we're a little bit hamstrung in that naturally our students are very wary of key workers moving in. Likewise, anybody that is already there that could be self-isolating could pass it on. So in an ideal world, we'd have a situation where we'd have empty buildings that could be used for alternative uses. The challenge then is, A, emptying a building, even if we've got another building in the same city, such as we have in Dundee or Glasgow, where we can move people across. The government has locked us down, so we can't move people. The second point is that it would be in breach of planning, because a lot of these buildings, as part of their planning, is given a very restrictive use, which is for students only. And then finally, we're into a position of VAT and costs, because student accommodation doesn't attract VAT in the same way that traditional hotels may. So again, how is that all taken into consideration? And to some extent, I have some sympathy with the governments of the United Kingdom, in that this movement has been very rapid during this crisis, but unfortunately, things haven't quite kept pace with necessarily the need that we're facing.
And as we head into the kind of summer period, Stuart, obviously it's kind of exceptional times just now, but this would quite often be the period when you would perhaps look to refurb or to maybe have some capital expenditure. I mean, what's the position on that just now, given the position in Scotland in particular with regards to social distancing for construction and other works?
Well, Chris, is a really interesting question. I mean, one we're seeing the problems with CapEx everywhere is not necessarily having the construction teams available to do work for us, but it's necessarily having the supply chain to carry out those works. So again, getting even the most simplest of materials is very, very difficult. The other challenge is that as I mentioned in my opening statement, is that the cash flow of these buildings is immediately lost in most instances, somewhere around 20 to 25% of their income. So they're naturally under pressure. So carrying out all but the very necessary, and by necessary I mean statutory or requirements from a health and safety point of view, from carrying out those necessary capex is very challenging in terms of cash flow.
And do you think, looking perhaps slightly further ahead, if there is going to be restrictions on, capital expenditure, refurb of existing accommodation, and presumably also an impact on the pipeline, if that's then coupled with deferrals and applications this year, is that likely to store up problems of supply potentially in the future?
I think there are real challenges with supply coming down the line. I think we're in a sort of a confluence of where a number of factors are hitting all at once, almost a perfect storm, if you will. Our number of 18-year-olds across the UK now increases significantly until 2030. So we're seeing a higher number of 18-year-olds come into the market. The next factor at play is, following every financial issue and financial crash that we've seen in this millennium, we've seen an increase in participation rate amongst 18-year-olds going to university. So 2002, 2008, and we assume the same this time. Excuse me. So those two factors alone make an issue. Next, if people do defer, and I'll talk a little bit more about why they may defer later, I'm sure, but if they do defer, then we'll see a huge increase in the number of students arriving next year. Then finally, you add in other factors, and Richard, in your statement, you mentioned about new legislation going through Holyrood. That is going to, even though that has got a limited lifetime in terms of its effect, well, it can be on the statutory book, it is going to make some investors a little bit nervous, and we'll start to see valuations changed accordingly on this. And therefore, land values may not change quickly enough, so people may not invest in Scotland. It could be a very fascinating time over the next 2 to 3 years when you would start to see buildings coming through to react in terms of the increase in need. So yeah, Chris, I think it's a really fascinating question, and one which we could probably fill another 2 or 3 of these series of podcasts in time.
So you're looking ahead then, Stewart, to, let's say, the next academic year from September 2020 onwards, and that obviously becomes the next focus for you. Have you got a sense of whether, for example, overseas students are still looking at UK as a place to study? Has there been a drop-off on that? And likewise, aside from overseas students, UK students, how's the order book looking for next year?
So our bookings are slightly behind last year, but not significantly, and that's making us quite buoyant. The number of internationals has dropped off slightly quicker than the number of domestics, but I had a conversation with UCAS earlier in the week, and they're still saying comparable numbers year on year. So that makes me feel very confident. Having said all of that, bookings are one thing, people turning up is another.
Yeah.
And UCAS feel the very same. The sentiment within the industry is that we're going to see a drop off of around 35 to 50% from our international market. And predominantly, that will be from the Chinese market. So cities such as St Andrews, Glasgow and Edinburgh are going to feel the brunt of that. And the reason for that is the same features that the UK and the 3 of us would have if we were traveling. We don't want to be stranded abroad, etc., etc. There's also another factor at play in that the media in China, and to some extent the media in Europe, doesn't think the UK has reacted very well to this pandemic. So that's necessarily having a knock-on effect to the number of students wishing to come here.
So if there's a 35 to 50% drop off of international students, and from that potentially fees for what might be considered as the 2020-2021 bad year, so to speak, there's an awful lot of rebuild required going forward to try and recoup the cost on the assumption that things materially change for the 21-22 academic year and beyond.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's not only from our point of view, it's from the university's point of view. A lot of universities have, I was reading the Times Higher Education at THE, and international students are likened to some kind of addictive drug. You know, they've absorbed it and kept going, and they never thought it would end, and unfortunately it has. This is hopefully, and I think that will be the case, hopefully, but I do believe it is the case, that this is only a speed bump. We're just going to have a little jolt this year, and we'll see a recovery in 21-22. But to get us through this period, we're advising our clients that they're probably only going to see around 85% of their normal income. Because don't forget, even if we can backfill with our UK students, we're going to see operating costs increase because we're going to have to clean significantly more often, and significantly deeper cleans. So operational costs will increase. And likewise, our engagement with students will have to increase and more online and all elements like that. So around 85% of income is likely to be seen between 19 and 20 and 21.
We've kind of seen overnight in Scotland here, Stewart, reports that universities are obviously facing quite a tough time generally. Have you had any sense of the impact that's likely to have on any lettings based on nomination agreements, and how likely these are to be honoured going forward?
I think nominations are in a very peculiar position. Often a nomination agreement wouldn't have a force majeure clause within there. Some do, some don't. We're seeing some universities asking if they can be released, either on a short term or a longer term. Each university is approaching it slightly differently. And as an operator and talking to our clients, they're in a very difficult position. Because naturally they have not necessarily banked that income, but mentally that is fairly stable cash, and that affects the value of their asset and therefore its worth. And if they were to deny breaking that nomination, then there will be PR and marketing issues for the following year. So there are real challenges whether to break from a university point of view, but also to accept that break from an owner's point of view. And I think it is very much on a case-by-case basis, Chris, as to whether universities actually need to break or whether they're just a little bit nervous at this stage in the cycle, or whether they'll see something more in the future. I don't know is the answer. But I think the key point is that it goes back to the point I was making earlier. It's still so dynamic and so fluid that nobody really knows.
And do you think there's a potential that it could even change the kind of nominations agreement model going forward? As you know, with the threat of this happening in the future, is the potential that we'll now see much shorter, maybe only 1 year at a time, nomination agreements being put in place as universities try to reduce any potential future exposure?
I think many universities were trying to do that anyway, and I know that you as a firm were advising on this because you're seeing nomination agreements appear on balance sheets for universities, and I know you've done a great deal of work around that. So a lot of universities were compressing that time anyway. But what I think we'll end up seeing is that, as you rightly say, Chris, that 5 years will quickly become 1 year agreement, and therefore the value of the building will be hit to some extent with that. So yeah, I think it's a time of change and a time of dynamism across the whole sector.
And Stewart, you mentioned there that we as a firm advising on those particular aspects for norms agreements. The other thing that we've obviously done over quite a considerable period of time is acquisition, development, funding and investment into all these vehicles, and with that come the various financial documents which you referred to there. We're obviously currently being asked by a number of clients to consider what their covenant breaches potentially could be under their loan documents for these financial models that are created. Is there any experience that you as operator have seen in relation to the owners and managers of these buildings, and any approach or aggressive approaches that they've had from their funders?
Very much so, and this is again, this is completely unprecedented. This would come completely out of left field, but not our clients, but some clients we're seeing of other people. Part of their covenant is that they have to call the rent. So as the consequence of that, they're calling the rent, and there's a high amount of bad debt, as one can imagine. Students are simply not paying; they're effectively on rent strike. But in position to that, the following year is going to be a knock-on effect for exceptionally bad PR, because they've been seen as the bad, naughty landlord that have called the rent. So by that covenant being in place and being really impressed upon by the finance house, is having quite significant effects on the value of the building and on the effectiveness of that building. So again, we're seeing a lot of owners having to have some quite serious and in-depth conversations with their finance to ensure that reality matches up with their needs and expectations. And I think that's very much where firms like yourself are going to be involved.
And just cutting to the current position under the legislation. So we're recording this on Friday the 15th of May, where at present there is legislation which is going through the processes at Holyrood in relation to the notice periods for termination. As I stressed at the start, that's not law yet, but it's intended that some sort of legislation will come to pass probably within the next week to 10 days. We're interested from an operator's point of view that if it was the case that existing agreements are now going to have the equivalent of a 7-day determination provision on the part of the student who can then leave on 7 days notice. As you've mentioned several times, Stuart, the finance model, operators, developers, funders, they all look for the model based on an income coming through. That's going to have a huge impact on an operator's view on how and which developments they take on board here, surely, in terms of no guarantee of secure income.
It's going to have a massive effect. Now, there are two ways to look at this, as always with these things. I think it's the 7 days, and this is providing certain aspects are attached to the law as it goes through Holyrood. Providing the 7 days is for term now up until September, fine. I think the guys that haven't refunded or haven't waived their rent, they're just going to have to swallow that. It's going to be law. If that's the case, then that's what it is. The second aspect, where a student can issue 28 days notice if they're unable to take up their accommodation in the academic year 2021, becomes a little bit more problematical. And the wording around that needs to be very, very limited as to when that can be enacted. Because otherwise, I think a lot of people are just going to be very, very nervous around that. And as you say rightly, Richard, people are going to be very nervous about spending any money on capital or any investment or anything in terms of opening buildings where effectively a student could disappear with 28 days notice. And I think, I must say this, I think unless this is very carefully worded going through Holyrood, it could have a substantial effect on the amount of investment into PBSA in Scotland. Because even though it's currently limited to this current pandemic and crisis, it will have certain confidence knock-on effects to an investor market.
And these are presumably views that, whilst it's totally understood why there should be 7 or 28-day notice. These are views that presumably you've shared through the SPF, through the appropriate channels?
Yes, so the SPF are hopefully making some room with the opposition to ensure that the wording is tightened up, that the 7 days does only apply to the current academic year. And there's also, hopefully, fingers crossed, an amendment regarding council tax, because what we don't want to see is an owner effectively allow a break in the student's tenancy and then get the double hit from the local council saying, well, now you've got an empty room, you need to give us council tax. We will see people go bust, and we will see buildings being put into administration if that's the case. It's just not a market that can afford that.
So you've touched on the council tax point there, Stewart, and obviously your capacity, you're CEO of one of the biggest student accommodation providers in the UK. So what do you think the government, that's the UK government and or the Scottish government, could do to ease pressure in the sector currently? Because what we've got over the last 10 to 15 years is an investment class which is recognised and which is here to stay, but we need to secure the future of development and investment in that going forward. Are there any particular highlights you think that the governments could be persuaded to consider and implement in legislation?
I think if we want to see the continued growth of this market, and I think it's worthwhile because growth in purpose-built enables houses of multiple occupancy to go back to housing stock for local people and local families and local professionals. So I think it is key that this market continues to grow. The key thing to keep it going is cash flow. So we're in a situation now where we can't house students because students don't want to be housed. We've got 30% occupancy, 35% as I mentioned earlier. But we've got a whole summer period where we can't have anybody in because tourism's closed down, but also we're limited by planning and we're limited by VAT. And we're going to be facing this challenge for the next at least 18 months. So I think there are a number of aspects that the government can help us with. I think the first is council tax. If we're letting people out, if we're being the good guy, we need to be helped by the government to show that we're being a good guy. So I think council tax is one element. I think some flexibility in planning. We're going to have a lot of people, myself included, and I'm sure you guys are the same, that want to go on holiday. We're not going to be going overseas. I want to come to Scotland and play golf. So student accommodation would make very good hostels, would make very good apartments for people to utilise in that way. So again, having that flexibility there in terms of that use, and again, the VAT treatment would be very useful from government and would again kickstart the tourist industry to some extent. And finally, would be again some flexibility in allowing young professionals to use some of this accommodation. There's going to be a number of graduates that are looking for not necessarily a house share, but they're looking for self-contained units, and we've got studio flats which are perfect for that. But again, unless there's flexibility in planning, we wouldn't have been able to house these needy people.
So it comes down to tax changes potentially, or flexibility, planning changes or flexibility, local tax changes or flexibility, and use changes and flexibility is something that you would like to see examined in the short to medium term future for the benefit of all, not just the PBSA industry.
Exactly. We're not looking for a long-term shift. That's, let's be honest, we're not looking for a long-term shift without full consultation, but some flexibility that could, because helping us will necessarily help the housing market, will help gain income, kick off tourism. So there's a lot of knock-on effects. It's not just this one industry that has a benefit for it.
I think like every industry out there, as you say, unprecedented times, and how we deal with this in the short to longer term will dictate what the future of this investment class is. and more importantly, how these buildings are put to good use for the short and longer term. So, Stewart, I just want to say it's clearly the case that CRM have been fully involved in every single facet and considering lots of things that they never considered would be top of their priority. It's obviously testament to your staff and your team that you've managed to achieve that. I think we look forward to seeing what happens over the coming week to 2 weeks in Scotland, depending upon the legislative reform which is proposed in terms of the tenancy agreements. And we will be posting updates on that on our website as and when that occurs. We welcome the day that you come to play golf in Scotland again, Stewart. You'll have to stick to your local course in Oxford in the meantime. But I think what I'd like just to close is to say I'd like to thank you very much for joining and sharing all of your experiences within our organisation. And thanks also to our listeners who've been listening to this. If you'd like more information on the subject we're talking about today or need anything else, then please just get in touch. You'll find that our contact details of Stewart, Chris and myself are shown on the screen. We've got a YouTube channel and we also have our COVID-19 hub on brodies.com to keep up to date with the latest insights information. But in the meantime, can I wish you a good afternoon and thanks again to Stewart Moore of CRM.